I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight. Crystal Huff, they them pronouns please, holds several titles, including author and editor of science fiction, educator, activist, and volunteer. As relates to the Somerville Gardening Club, Crystal has lived and gardened in Somerville for over 15 years, and they are a founding member of the Gardening Collective Working Group within mutual aid of Medford and Somerville, also known as Mamas. Crystal spends hours every week on work for Mamas, the Somerville Community Fridges, and similar community-oriented mutual aid projects. Tonight's talk is entitled Mutual Aid Gardening, Somerville and Beyond. Mutual aid is the idea that everyone has something to offer and everyone has things that they need. Mutual aid gardening combines the skill sets and knowledge and material resources and spaces of neighbors in a true community effort for gardening. The goal is usually to grow nutritious food for the community, but occasionally a garden will be established more generally to support local pollinators. Mutual Aid of Medford and Somerville, Mamas, is a recent local continuation of a long line of mutual aid organizations and mutual aid efforts around the world, spanning generations of human history. Within Mamas, the Gardening Collective, sometimes called the Food Sovereignty Working Group, has helped establish and maintain 20 local gardens since the beginning of 2021. This talk is an attempt to introduce mutual aid gardening and Mamas to the Somerville Gardening Club officially, in order to offer gardening assistance for those who are interested, and get feedback on how Mamas could be better supporting local efforts to garden with our neighbors.
So Mutual Aid of Medford and Somerville, or Mamas, is a mutual aid organization within Medford and Somerville, as you might imagine. And I'm particularly here to talk with you about the Gardening Collective, which is a working group within Mamas. We like to say that we foster gardens and also neighborly friendships. And I'm going to talk with you about that. So I'm going to this is sort of an overview. I'm going to talk about what Mamas is, what the Gardening Collective is within Mamas, how mutual aid gardening works, some examples of Mamas gardens, how the Mamas gardens are used, some specific ways that folks can get involved, and then there will be questions and feedback time. This is our very noisy semi-logo for Mutual Aid Medford and Somerville. Mamas started out as a socialist snow shoveling brigade in like 2019, kind of, but with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, very quickly expanded in March of 2020 in response to the need that we saw emerging. We are entirely community run. We are an explicitly anti-capitalist organization, and we are very open to folks joining us in however works best for them. In terms of mutual aid is one of our mantras is mutual aid is about everybody having things that they need and everybody having something to offer. It is not transactional, but communal, and we like to think of it in terms of solidarity rather than charity. We are in solidarity with each other. Mamas values and belief, and you can also find some of these explicated a lot more on our website. But again, everyone has something to offer. Everyone has something they need. Needing things isn't a personal failing. Everyone deserves dignity and stability. Mutual well-being is individual well-being is collective well-being. Mamas is in response to the crisis and obviously has not ended with the crisis ramping down, depending on how you see COVID-19 in the US, I suppose. We follow our values by keeping things as simple as possible, keeping things as safe as possible. We try to spread out and distribute the work that we do. We try to only make commitments for what we believe we can accomplish and finish. We try to do a lot of listening and reflecting with the community. That is one of my goals in this discussion and at the end of this presentation. We work toward language justice. We try to center racial justice. We have what we like to call a working group distributed structure. The Gardening Collective is a working group. There are several others within Mamas, and some of them have shifted as time has gone on in terms of priority or in terms of emphasis or in terms of volunteers within Mamas having the capacity to do the work. Some of the coordinators, we meet weekly. We make decisions by consensus on a monthly coordinator call, but we also talk daily with neighbors. Neighbors can talk with us through our request form on the website, through calling our hotline number, through emailing us at our email address, which I will reiterate, but is askyourmamas@gmail.com. When someone requests help from Mamas, particularly someone who is explicitly located in Somerville or Medford, we receive the request and we don't apply any means testing. We don't say, oh, are you within this income bracket? Nothing like that you might get from a government organization. We don't judge people for their needs or their requests. And we really try not to collect or store private information that we don't need in order to fulfill the request. This is partially to make sure that we are protecting the overall safety needs of some of our neighbors who come to us who are undocumented, unhoused, or both. There are many ways that Mamas tries to support our community. A big one that you might have heard about is that we provide financial assistance and redistribute a lot of money. Since March of 2020, we have redistributed over $700,000. That figure might actually be 725 by now. We provide volunteers and information around housing justice. We provide emotional and spiritual support. We deliver groceries and grocery cards when folks need them. We try to assist with food security in terms of both the grocery deliveries team and the gardening collective team. We also have what we call neighborhood pods, which are neighborhood groups of folks who might be on a WhatsApp group or an email list or whatnot to coordinate even more hyper locally with each other about needs and offers. And in terms of, now we get into the gardening collective specifically. So this is the part of the discussion that I have made all of the slides. You will see a lot of photos that I have taken. Feel free to ask me about any of these photos. But if you do have questions, please save questions to the end unless they're a clarifying question, like I don't recognize that acronym, or just a quick question like that can be clarified. Okay, so let's talk about the Gardening Collective. The Mamas Gardening Collective was formulated in 2021, so over a year or about a year since Mamas itself began. We try to combine people's resources they express, like they might have land or soil or seeds or a skill set or time, and combine that with folks being able to take what they need of the Gardening Collective. The vegetables that we produce together, folks can harvest. The friendships that we share together, hopefully everyone takes of that of the group freely, as well as offers. And in the bottom right in this slide, you can see one of our monthly coordinator meetings, actually, which was in my garden in Porter Square area. We just sort of after doing our coordination of different efforts for the working groups, I said, hey, we're actually in one place in one time and we haven't been for a while. Let's take a photo. The garden actually looks fairly decent right now. I did not notice that the trash bins were behind some of us, but and I was actually wearing the same shirt I'm wearing now, which is my gardening t-shirt, which is, I have enough plants, said no gardener ever. So Mama's Gardening Collective, again, we started in 2021. We started out with about 14 gardens, which I was fairly impressed by. Some of them were pre-established, and some of them we established during 2021. We had about 80 volunteers that year. We had dozens of outdoor work days to coordinate, planting days, setting up garden days, coordinating like sign creation, trellising options, a whole bunch of stuff. Then last year in 2022, we expanded to about 20 gardens between Somerville and Medford. It's sometimes a little bit hard to tell whether some gardens are still active within Mama's, active in general, but potentially just serving the household that's hosting the garden at that point. And so overall, we have established around 25 gardens, but we think that about 20 of them were active last year. And we're hoping that this year will continue that trend of a little bit of expansion, a little bit of pivoting for some of the locations. Our goal in general is to increase food access, and what we call food sovereignty, as opposed to food insecurity within our two cities. It is very corny, but it really is true that we consider every veggie shared to be a success. This is in part because a lot of our gardeners are newer to gardening, but in part also because when you have put such effort into gardening, in particular food gardening in New England, particularly during drought, such as we experienced last year, it really is a thing to celebrate that we have produced food that we can use to feed ourselves and our households and our neighbors. So how does this work? We talk with folks who might be available to host and have available land. We talk with people about what kind of involvement they might be up for. We have helped set up gardens. We have taken on maintenance of gardens that are already set up. We make a plan for maintenance of the gardens, preferably with collaboration with the host, but that's not required. And sometimes disaster has totally struck. We do our best. This photo on this slide is of the CrossFit Mama's Garden, which over the course of our time working on this garden became rat central because it was across the street from the new Union Square T-stop. And in the process of digging out the T-stop, all of the rats seem to move into the Eversource site, which is on the other side of this tree on this slide. It was kind of a travesty. And we have had to rethink a lot about this garden as a result. We started out growing lots of tomatoes in this garden and some hot peppers, and we harvested very few of those tomatoes ourselves. And this past year, we planted some new raspberry canes, and we planted some pawpaw seedlings, and we planted some, I think, American chestnut and American, oh goodness, now I'm forgetting, but a number of native longer term plants that over time will fruit, we hope. And that will be much less attractive to the rats. We also planted one of these beds entirely with onions and garlic. We hope that the rats get their comeuppance. We'll see. It's a sometimes it's just a struggle. So in terms of some specific gardens that Mamas has, most of these I think we started, except mine. But I'm going to run you through a couple of Mama's gardens, and certainly ones that we help maintain. So this is the Union Square garden in front of the SDA TV building, which you might know of as being in the very center of Union Square, behind where the farmers market is in the summer. That makes it really visible in terms of neighbors having access to the garden, which is great for us. It also makes it a lot easier to maintain because employees of SCA TV literally help water the garden every day when it hasn't rained. Super appreciate that. We, in this garden in particular, try to focus on food plants that can be eaten raw or fresh, because this garden is in part in support of our unhoused neighbors who are often hanging out in Union Square and are food insecure. They need more support than they are receiving. So we tried really hard to grow lots of cherry tomatoes, lots of beans. We did grow some eggplant here. We grew lots of radishes. We tried to grow some carrots. Carrots last year really did not do well. We grew some cucumbers, and we just tried to make it really clear with this garden in particular, it is open access. It is for everyone. Anybody can rock up to this garden and harvest something, weed something, water, and that's what these blurry on the photos signs say in English and Spanish is everyone is welcome here. You can harvest what you need. You can help out if you are up for it. This garden has those presets. This is the Hyperspace Garden, which is actually down the street from me near Porter Square on Elm Street. And this is a garden that the homeowner said, I know very little about gardening, but we have a new house and we have plenty of space and we are up for it. And so we took a bunch of these yellow bins, which are available to mamas for $1 a piece through a food pantry that we also try to work with for food distribution. We took a bunch of these yellow bins, which are food safe. We drilled extra drainage in them. We spray painted them with our little stencil. We made lots of signs, and we planted them with kohlrabi and beans and ground cherries and tomatoes and eggplants and squashes and cucumbers and kaolu. We had a great work day with some of the teens at Somerville High School, in particular, some of the teens who I think are involved with the Climate Ambassadors program at Somerville High School. And two of these photos are from that day. You can also notice in the bottom right-hand picture, there are a bunch of yellow bins, and then there's one bin that's missing where the sign is. This was actually a really interesting test of our values and mission for us. The sign says, take what you want, like all are welcome. And someone came up to the garden and at some point during 1 week last summer, took one of the bins with them to continue growing the eggplant elsewhere. And that really surprised us. And it's kind of a success of our program because they took what they want and could use. And it was also very disconcerting. And we sort of had to sit and think with ourselves, you know, how do we feel about this? What should we potentially do about it? If anything, what we decided was that we would change our signage to say harvest what you want, to make it a little more clear that that was what we were thinking people would do. But also people have come up to my garden in recent past and asked if I had things that I could share. And I have absolutely said, I have this to share. I have these seedlings. People know to walk past my house in the spring and see if I have seedlings I'm hardening off. I very rarely refuse a reasonable request. This setting is different depending on who is the host and who is the gardener or the main garden coordinator. But I very rarely refuse a reasonable request. The only time I think I outright refused a request was when somebody asked me if they could have my garden table. And I really like having a little bit of furniture in my garden because it's also my social space. Because my household is immunocompromised, this is how we get to see our friends and talk to people. But at any rate, this is the Hyperspace Garden. And it was a really exciting project. And we already have more work that's being done on it now for this year. And that's really that's a success story for us. This is my garden, which we call my household Area 52, because we are science fiction fans and science fiction professionals. Oh, and I am getting a message saying you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? Oh, I think that the Tufts building just kicked them off. We're going to hit pause for a moment. And I'm going to check with Kelly and see if that's what happened. All right, Cynthia. I don't hear you.
How would it go on mute?
All right. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
The slide about the hyperspace garden.
We can go back to the previous slide on the Hyperspace Garden. Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. And thank you, Kelly, for sending me a note. Even though my notifications are not making noise right now, I did notice that my phone told me that you were trying to talk to me. Oh, how do I reverse course on? Give me 1 second. I tried to. All right. I will go back to sharing my screen. And not that one. This one. All right. All right. Can you now see the slide for Hyperspace Garden again? Yes. Great. Okay. So I was talking about Hyperspace Garden, and I had gone into the story of how one of the yellow bins was taken by one of our neighbors. Cynthia is nodding, so you did catch that part. So I think that was the main point that I wanted to make on this slide. Okay. Yeah, I have a tendency to talk plenty in terms of filling the time. And so I wrote very terse notes for myself in terms of things that I wanted to make sure that I said. And that is the thing that I wanted to make sure that I said about Hyperspace Garden. We really, in the end, we appreciate the framing that is a success story in terms of our community communication, talking about how important it is to share our resources and make them available to folks in whatever way works for them. So the next garden that I want to talk about is my own, and I will tell you, I had a lot of difficulty figuring out what photos to share about my own garden, which is part of why several of the other slides in this presentation have other photos of my garden. I love my garden and I take lots of photos of it. And if you ever want to talk about just my garden and all the ridiculous things within it, happy to do so. But one of the things about my garden is that I have not always considered it a mutual aid garden. And this happens sometimes for Mama's projects, is that they start out as an individual's thing and then it sort of becomes a community thing. And for my garden, I had been worried about a stalker situation and didn't want my garden to be listed as a Mama's garden because I didn't want to be on the public map. And we hadn't really figured out when we first started out that you didn't have to be on the public map in order to be a Mama's garden. And I had been worried about how much I already do in my garden and how little space I have for other people to garden within it. And I hadn't really been thinking about how much I need to be able to share from my garden in order to not put food in the compost, because in the start of 2020, I had friends in Wuhan in China. I absolutely became really concerned about the food supply, and I more than doubled the amount of space that I was gardening in between 2020 and 2021. We depaved half of our driveway to turn it into more garden space and more efficient garden space. We added something like 35 arches of these really tall arches that you see in several of these photos into our garden. We added a second squash arbor. We added raised beds. We became good producers of food. And I really have been blessed by one of the folks in my neighborhood who is housing insecure, rolling up to my garden on his bike and saying, "Hey, I hear you do mutual aid gardening, and I'm here to harvest. If there's anything that's available to harvest right now, please let me know. I don't want to take anything that I'm not welcome to. I'm a gardener. I really want to respect your garden. I love gardening, but I would love to make use of some of the garden produce if there's some available." And I was really pulled up short and surprised. My garden has a lot of the same yellow bins that are in the other mutual aid gardens. But I had been thinking of it as a private garden, but I said, well, I mean, you need resources and you are here and I can help. We absolutely have things you can harvest. And I started showing him some of the things that he could harvest. And he started talking with me about his gardening experience. And over the course of that summer, I would say, which I think was summer of 2021, I would say that he came to my garden every other week, maybe. And every time there was something, whether it was, a few pounds of tomatoes or some spinach or callaloo. My garden produced a lot of callaloo over the past few years. There was always something. And he was incredibly helpful, and we would start texting each other when he was heading over so that I would know and could be available to show him what was easiest to harvest and whatnot. Anyway, he became super helpful when I was less able to keep up with the watering during the drought. He came out and helped get water from my 3 rain barrels into the various containers that were drying out the fastest. He kept fish, and he brought me some of the fish water in terms of a little bit extra nitrogen fertilizer. He helped maintain the garden in some other ways that I will probably never realize were him. And it has been a really great partnership. He also brought me some of the plants that he started. At the end of last year, he brought me a couple of citrus plants that are supposed to be hardy in our zone, which I did not know was an option. And so now I have 2 citrus plants that are, you know, yay big, but someday I'm ready for them to grow up a bit. And I brought them in for the winter because I was worried, but I'm thinking about maybe leaving one out next winter and seeing how hardy it really is. And this has just been a great partnership that I would never have had if not for Mamas and our attitude of mutual aid gardening. Also, in terms of this slide, I want to point out 2 other things. One is, of course, the photo in the upper right, which you might notice is Kelly and I and our friend Suzanne had a lovely day of socializing in my garden, which was super exciting, and which is one of the other purposes of Mama's Gardens, frankly, to provide space that is safe for those who are more cautious around COVID risk, to be able to still have lots of time for socialization with our neighbors and our friends. And the other thing I want to point out about this is just a point of pride. The little picture of my thumb with a pepper is my last pepper harvest from the plants that I grew last year, but I actually harvested it in January of this year because I brought the peppers inside, and that was the last producing week, was sometime in January. I received this one pepper, and then I cut them all back to winterize them for this coming year, of the ones that I brought inside. So that is my garden, which is Area 52. This is the Union Square CrossFit Garden, which I talked about briefly a little bit earlier in terms of the rat problem. We had a work day with a bunch of tough students in the fall, after deciding to reevaluate this garden and what we could grow that would be helpful in terms of food, and in terms of rat resistance. So this is tough students from the Leonard Carmichael Society, which Somerville Gardening Club folks might realize is the like charitable works club at Tufts University. If you don't already know this, and if you ever want to have tough students descend upon you in numbers of, 10 to 30, say to help with a plant sale, these are the folks I recommend you talk with. They bring lots of energy. They were fantastic. And they really helped us reformat this garden, refill all of the beds with the soil and compost that we had been building up for years, harvest all of the potatoes you might see in the bottom right that had managed to produce, and then plant new garlic and onion seedlings, plant these local fruit trees, particularly several pawpaws. We also did plant some raspberries, which I know are not natives, but were a very attractive option. And so we did do that with part of this garden. And the other thing to know about this garden, aside from like it's in Union Square, it's at the CrossFit, it's across the street from the new T station, and all of those details. It's also one of the 3 locations of community fridges in Somerville, which are there to help folks who are food insecure. And so one of the things that we do with any Mama's garden that is overproducing in something for any particular week, or that in this garden in particular, just about all of the produce from this garden tends to go into the community fridge, which is on the other side of the CrossFit building. And the lower left-hand photo here with me and my blue seal mask and a local high schooler, we are standing in front of the side of the community fridge shed at the CrossFit building. And the community fridge is something that I can also talk a lot about, but I won't here. But it's an aspect of the CrossFit garden that helps us utilize all of the produce that this garden produces. So in case it's not obvious, there are many different options for gardening mutually. We do some pollinator support in general. This middle photo is one of the red cardinal flowers, which is a native pollinator that I have actually attracted hummingbirds with, which was really freaking exciting. It's just like, I want to try to demonstrate some of the breadth and depth of the options for you folks, because I think that this might be a great option, particularly for Somerville Gardening Club members who are wondering if they can really manage all of their garden this year. So any and all are welcome. You would also be welcome to share information with us as experienced gardeners. I saw some of you smile when my intro was read, and it said that I have been gardening for at least 15 years in Somerville. I know that that is probably, I am still a baby gardener compared to everyone else here. I'm proud of having gardened for basically my adult life, but I appreciate that I am still, as we say in sci-fi, I am still but an egg when it comes to the vast experience that is available at Somerville Gardening Club. And you see here we have had booths at the Union Square Farmers Market to talk about Mamas in general, to talk about the Gardening Collective in particular, to share some of the produce that we've made, particularly when cucumbers are in season at the gardens. I make a lot of pickles, a lot of pickles, and we share them from the gardens and with the community fridges and with the community in general. So again, the food from the gardens goes to the host, the garden managers, the neighborhood, the community fridges, anyone else who wants it. We don't discourage people from taking food grown in Mama's gardens, particularly Mama's gardens that are publicly accessible, like very, very demonstrably a Mama's garden, because we think that this is, or we know that this is a social support that our neighbors who are unhoused have in particular really benefited from and needed at times. And it's worth noting that this month, in fact, March 4th, saw the end of some of the pandemic levels of support for folks who are food insecure. Some of the SNAP benefits that were available to folks in 2020, 2021, 2022 have diminished or ceased entirely as of this month. And there are some government programs that now go back to expecting people to be able to feed themselves on $4 a day. And that's just really, really unlikely in Somerville in particular. And that is also part of why we do this. So ways to be involved with Mama's Gardening Collective. There are many ways, but folks can sign up to be a garden manager, which involves coordinating like watering schedule or making sure that a garden is planted and cared for regularly, maybe scheduling a work day in order to do like setting up all the trellising for the season or whatnot. People can also say, hey, I want to do some gardening, but I don't want to be in charge of anything. There's always watering, weeding, and planting to be done. We have work days during season, probably every other week, sometimes every week, that folks can join us for, or they can say, hey, I'm down the street from this particular garden and help out with that particular garden. It's always welcome for folks to help harvest the food, either to take back to your household or to share with your neighbors or to take to the community fridges. There are also ways like painting signs, putting together other materials for the gardens. There are lots of ways to help out with Mama's gardens. We also, and Cynthia will smile at this, we have quite frequent need for folks to transport supplies. Cynthia is on my speed dial, textually speaking, when we have dirt or containers or seedlings that need to be transported, because a lot of us do not have cars. A few of us have cargo bikes, but a lot of us don't have any other method of transport. And Kelly, I also would note, lent Mama's her rolly cart. And we've used that to transport quite a lot of things for Mama's to and from the fridges. We have still kept it clean in terms of not transporting dirt in it, just to reassure you, because I believe it's a loan, but we do a lot of transporting things. And so even if somebody says like, hey, I don't know how often I would be available, but I'm up for being on the email list or being texted when something needs to be transported, that's a way to volunteer. We also always appreciate help with publicity. Like we have a couple of folks with artistic ability. I am not particularly one of them. You will see that in the simplicity of my slides. But we always appreciate help with anything along those lines. And in particular of note for Somerville Gardening Club folks, we always appreciate somebody offering to host a Mama's garden or to make their garden into a Mama's garden or to give space within their garden to Mama's use. And we would be happy to talk more about that if that's something you're interested in. We also always have lots of admin work, which as gardeners is not necessarily our favorite thing. And I know that I in particular am pretty poor at email. And I always appreciate a volunteer who's willing to come in and just look at the inbox and reply to some of the emails with even just a template email saying like, here's when we're currently meeting and how to join the meetings. And here's the garden closest to you and the garden coordinator's contact info. That's all stuff that we could use more volunteers for if that's something that you'd like to do to be involved. I mentioned this earlier, but we do have the gardens helping maintain the community fridges in Somerville. There are 3 community fridges in Somerville and 2 of them have Mama's gardens next to them. We already talked about the CrossFit garden. This is the other garden next to a community fridge at 36 Sewell Street. And actually, I should probably update this picture of the fridge because that fridge has since been replaced with a newer one, which is great as someone who volunteers with the fridges. But we have this series of homemade planters and some additional pots next to the fridge. And I believe that my friend Omi might be a member of the SGC. Or might be joining the SGC, the Somerville Gardening Club. Yes, I did get the acronym correct. And Omi is potentially going to be the garden coordinator for this garden at Sewell Street because it's down the street from her house. And that is super appreciated because I do not live near Sewell and I sort of half functioned as the garden coordinator for this garden last year, and that was not terribly effective. This garden does have the benefit of some irrigation set up on a timer, which was fantastic. And I'd love more help with that if anybody has experience with that. And suggestions. So I think we are almost to the end here. I do want to note the Mama's Gardening Collective and mutual aid gardening in general has its limits. Urban gardeners in New England know this, but our gardens are small, they are limited by the seasons, they're unlikely to be the only source of groceries for a family, never mind a neighborhood. But what I will say is that last year, at least twice when I was doing a hotline shift for the Mama's hotline, we received a call from folks who were food insecure and needed more food and resources. And we were able to provide them with a car full of food, in part by going out and collecting food from Mama's Gardens. And that was really special for me. I did not think that we had the capacity to do that, but we actually genuinely fed 2 families for at least a few days last summer, primarily from our gardens. And I'm just really proud of us for that. There are lots of options for what folks can do in a Mama's garden. We talked about work days. We also talked about socializing in the garden. We also try to do a compost collection and redistribution day with Garbage to Garden a couple of times during the year. And that has happened twice last year at CrossFit Garden. So that might also be of interest to folks here. And we also have done some educational events. We've done some formal classes. We have done some introvert reading party time underneath like the arches in my garden. Frequently we'll have conversations with neighbors in the gardens. There are lots of options. Mutual aid gardening can be a little chaotic. You'll note my photo is on this slide. I am a little chaotic, but it's less chaotic than you might expect. Occasionally folks come into a garden and do something unexpected, like take the yellow bin or double plant something or weed out your carefully selected onions and garlic, thinking that they are weeds. We had that happen with ground cherries last year. But it's not as chaotic as you might think. And I also do want to note, finally, about privacy in the gardens. There are several people, not just me, who are potentially worried about our privacy and safety, and folks can absolutely choose to host a Mama's Garden or part of a Mama's Garden and not be on the public map on the website. Like some gardens have signs and some don't. Some gardens, the host will talk with their neighbors and welcome their neighbors into the garden, but that's the extent of it. Our goal is to increase food production and pollinator support and neighborly connections. And we're not going to enforce how that happens for people. And so I just wanted to note that in terms of your privacy as well, if you're interested in participating in one of the ways that involve like hosting. And also I wanted to ask if anybody has stuff to spare. We reuse a lot of stuff, and we are always looking for more stuff, which we then potentially text Cynthia about transporting. Basically everything that we do to set up gardens and maintain them is donated. And the Mama's Gardening Collective budget last year was $80 for the year, and we did not go over budget. So we do a lot with donated materials, etc. And we really appreciate anything that folks can do to pitch in. So all of that said, here is a lovely photo of some of the variety of beans that I grew last year in my garden. And now is time for questions or thoughts or feedback. You can also talk specifically with us in email at mamasgardeningcollective@gmail.com. The overarching Mamas email address is askyourmamas@gmail. But this is specifically for the gardening collective coordinators to reach us at this email. And there were a couple of things sent to chat. And there was a private message asking about rabbits in the neighborhood and how we handle rabbits as opposed to rats. And I would say that rabbits have not been a huge concern. We do have nibblers. We've actually seen a rabbit specifically in my garden, like dart underneath my friend's legs. And at the same time, the bulk of the pest problem is the rats. And that's where we focused our pest concern energy. Terry asked, how many pounds do we harvest a year? We don't quantify that, or we haven't in the past. What I will say is that I know that we grew over 40 varieties of tomatoes, and 4 or 5 varieties of eggplant, 2 varieties of callaloo, and what was another thing that we grew? A lot of different kinds of summer squashes and winter squashes and cucumbers, beans, lots and lots of beans. I have so many different kinds of beans. I am obsessed with beans. So I can quantify, and I have a Google spreadsheet of the different kinds of seeds that we planted, and the variety of things that we planted and planned for. We didn't usually weigh the produce coming out of the garden, in part because like folks can come and harvest at any time. I will say that I was particularly proud of a couple of tomatoes that we got that were over 1.5 pounds. Go team, particularly during a drought. And I wish now that I had put more photos in the slide of, like, I took a photo of this large amount of tomatoes that we harvested, because when the tomatoes are in season, there were a lot of them, and a fair amount of eggplants, but I don't know how much specifically. So does anyone else have thoughts, questions, feedback?
You can use the microphone that's. My question has to do with lead in the soil and how you have addressed that in the various locations, especially ones that are close to, say, McGrath Highway or whatnot.
Yeah, an excellent question. So we have a few gardens that are in locations that we were concerned about the soil content, and we paid to send away for testing. Again, because we had only $80 in our budget last summer, we, as the gardening collective, did not pay for that test. I believe that the hosts of the garden paid, but also sometimes we pass around the same $20 amongst ourselves. The test generally cost $50 per location tested. At least that's my recollection. And we did do the tests for a couple of gardens. We were worried. With one garden, there was a high level of lead content and other contaminants, and we decided that we were only going to make that garden into a pollinator support garden. We planted a lot of bee balm. We planted a lot of marigolds. What else did we plant there? We also did plant some raspberry bushes there. The discussion that we had with the host was that they not plant anything there that was going to have the greens be a harvestable, like edible, because that is where a lot of the lead shows up the most in plants that are in leaded soil. That's where a lot of the lead gets drawn up into the plant. in locations where there was some lead, but not that high level, we talked about, do we want to plant directly in the soil? Do we want to plant in bins above the soil, but some of the roots might go down through? That is what we ended up deciding to do in at least 2 locations. And we planted plants there that were not going to be greens eaten. So I believe there we planted some tomatoes, and in one location, again, some raspberry plants, because they're easy, frankly, for new gardeners in particular. And the host said that they were fine with always having raspberries from then on. What else did we do? We did talk quite a bit about this. We do a fair bit of figuring out if we have like enough resources to establish a container garden or a raised bed garden in a location that hadn't previously had a garden, which tends to ameliorate some of the concern there in terms of soil contaminants, because we can create a barrier, or we can just scoop out some of the contaminated dirt and replace it with good dirt. We bought something like 10 yards of soil or soil mixed with compost from Black Earth 2 years ago, and then another 5 last year. And we had the compost distribution days with Garbage to Garden. So that's where we got some of that soil. But yeah, so I think that is the answer, is it depends on the location, it depends on the host, and it depends on what we're trying to grow there, or what we're hoping to do with the location.
All right. Lise is going to have a question here. No? You're turning off the microphone? Okay. Gotcha. And I will say, if you have a chance to visit Crystal's garden, it is really spectacular. The breadth of things that they grow, and also those arches really are, I mean, it's like escaping to a little tiny fantasy world to sit under those and just socialize. Highly recommend. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because we talked briefly about your hosting an open garden at some point. I'm going to hold you to it.
Yes. So one of the things I was talking with Cynthia about is that I have very intentionally made my garden into some spaces where socialization can happen, even with some space apart from the people you're socializing with. And I apologize to folks that some folks need to head out or are late for 8 o'clock meetings. No worries. There will be a recording. And also thank you for the feedback. And please, if you have further feedback, you can always reach out to me. You can ask Cynthia for my personal info. Please talk to me about anything that you thought or had feedback about or had questions about from this talk. So in terms of what I was talking about with Cynthia, I grew a lot of hot peppers last year. Last year in particular, banner year for hot peppers. And I had hot peppers coming out of my nose. And I really upped my game in terms of producing different kinds of hot sauces with the hot peppers. Roasted hot peppers with hot sauce made with fermented hot peppers, hot sauce made with pineapple, hot sauce made with blueberries, hot sauce made with vinegar, like a whole bunch of different, like I could do an entire hot sauce tasting. I created at least like 20 different batches of recipe types of hot sauce. It was really ridiculous. I did not start out as someone who could eat hot sauce. And so one of the things that we did with Mamas at the end of last season that I would love to replicate with the Somerville Gardening Club is we had a day when I just said to folks, like, bring something that you would try hot sauce on. Nacho chips, piece of bread, piece of cheese, like whatever works for you. Bring your own thing to put hot sauce on. And I will bring out like my little bottles of the current 20 batches of hot sauces, and I will try to arrange them in terms of heat levels. And you can taste them and chat with people about them and ask me how they were made. Some of the bottles are very well labeled in terms of how they were made, and some of the bottles are not. But I thought that this might be really fun to do as a Somerville Gardening Club activity that would be just basically social, and that like my garden would probably have enough space for, particularly before it's really robustly going for the season, before everything is like growing into your face. And so I would love to host something like that in the spring before things go really chaotic.
That would be great. Evelyn, you've got a question? Okay, we're just approaching the other microphone. Hello? Yep.
Hi, Crystal. So the bins that you contain when you're doing a container garden, are you? I'm curious to know what you do with the soil. So do you empty all those bins every spring and start with new soil? Do you, what is the approach to the soil in the bins?
So I also teach the container gardening class for the Master Urban Gardener course. And I taught that class last week, and this question also came up there of how do you handle the need to refresh or replace soil in so many containers. And the answer is that practically speaking, we don't replace it. We do check on it. It depends on how thorough the garden host, garden coordinator, garden manager, like those three roles, people overseeing the garden, depends on how thorough they are being, and what capacity they have for it. It depends on if the previous year we noticed that there was powdery mildew in some areas of the garden, that might incline us to be more likely to replace the soil. It depends on how many bins we're talking about. Our primary method on that front is actually not to replace and not to do too much disturbance of the soil, but to try to take the top layer of soil, take off the mulch layer, which is usually straw, but sometimes wood chips in Mama's gardens because those materials are cheap or free. And we disturb the top layer and stir it up, get a little aeration in without doing too much in terms of tilling. And we add in more compost because we have access to a lot of compost. We potentially add in some vermiculite or perlite as well, in terms of creating more space in the soil, and adding more materials that might wick water around. We might add some cocoa coir if somebody has donated cocoa coir, but it's generally an additive and a decompacting of soil in our containers rather than a replacing. Soil, as you know, can compact and shift and diminish tremendously in terms of soil level in containers over the course of a year or two. And that's how we try to address it. But we really, even in some of the newer gardens where there are some gardens that are only maybe 20 containers that are, a recent addition to a Mama's garden, that's still a lot of containers to dump out and remix or dump out and replace. And we don't really have the materials and the finances to thoroughly replace things there. So we try to provide additives and remixing. Yeah. Oh, I would also say that several of the folks in the Mama's Gardening Collective, but I in particular also do a lot of worm composting with red wigglers. And so that's another of our additives, basically, is I now have 2 wormeries. There are 2 other wormeries in the collective, and with all of the worm castings that we get, we have an additional material to mix in, which is beneficial to our plants for next season.
Great. Any other questions? I wanted to give a quick update. Liz Loveland offered some plants. We sent an email around, and she's got a abbreviated list of what's left over. So what she's got left is the reverted arrowhead vine, some of her amaryllis bulbs, window boxes, and some pots. So if you need me to put you in touch with her, just shoot me an email. All right. Okay.
I do just want to reiterate, like, I bring this presentation to you because I really do want to know if any Somerville Gardening Club members want any kind of supports from us, of any of the kinds that I've demonstrated during this talk, or if there's something else that occurs to you that would be really helpful. Like, maybe you want to be the maintainer of your garden in general, but you really need help, you know, setting up your trellising for the year, and you just can't do it by yourself. We can help. Just talk to us. Like, we want to be here for our community, and you are our community too.
Thank you for your interest in Mamas and Mutual Aid Gardening. If you have any questions, you can reach the Gardening Collective Working Group at mamasgardeningcollective@gmail.com. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation, you can do so on our Open Collective page at www.opencollective.com/mamas. These email addresses and links are also available in the video description below. Take care of yourself and your community, everyone. Mutual aid is mutual flourishing.